A seismic shift is happening in global politics. For over 70 years, the world ran on a pretty specific operating system, an architecture of alliances built on American power. Countries like Australia based their entire security and foreign policy on this foundation. But what happens when that very foundation starts to crack? What do you do when the anchor of the system becomes the source of its instability? In a move that's sending shockwaves from Washington to Beijing, Australia has signaled a stunning new direction in its foreign policy. It has extended a formal invitation, not to the American president, but to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, to deliver a special address to its parliament in March 2026. Make no mistake, this isn't just a speech, it's a statement, a declaration that Australia is exploring a new, audacious global strategy, one that doesn't automatically defer to the United States. Now, while the full fallout remains to be seen, the forces driving this are very, very real. We're going to dissect the explosive speech that set this all in motion, analyze the strategic calculation behind Australia's pivot, and explore what this means for the United States, for China, and for the future of the international order. How did we get to this point? And what does it mean for a world caught between two giants? It all started with a single speech, delivered not in a quiet diplomatic cable, but on the world stage at the World Economic Forum in Davos. In January 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up to the podium and gave what's been called the most important speech on Canadian foreign policy in over 75 years. He didn't just critique the global order, he essentially declared it dead. Carney put it bluntly, saying, "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition." He argued that the rules-based international order, a comforting phrase for decades, was over. In its place was a brutal new reality where great powers, namely the United States under a second Trump administration and Xi Jinping's China, were weaponizing the very tools of global connection. Tariffs have become leverage, financial systems are tools of coercion, and supply chains are now vulnerabilities to be exploited. Then came the line that echoed across the globe, a phrase that would define a new way of thinking for nations caught in the middle. Middle powers must act together, Carney warned, because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. He received a standing ovation, a rare sight at Davos, a clear sign that his message had struck a deep, resonant chord. For countries like Australia, watching the reliability of their main security partner erode, Carney's words weren't just a speech, they felt like a lifeline. To get why this invitation to Mark Carney is so significant, you have to understand the deep anxiety gripping Canberra. For decades, Australian foreign policy has been a masterful balancing act. It has used its ironclad alliance with the U.S. for security while building a massive economic partnership with China, its biggest customer. This strategy worked just fine as long as Washington and Beijing kept up at least a pretense of a working relationship. But that era is long gone. The geopolitical landscape of 2026 is one of open, aggressive rivalry. Australia is trapped, caught in the crossfire of a trade and technology war. The United States, its protector, has become increasingly transactional and unpredictable. The second Trump administration has doubled down on an America-first foreign policy, treating alliances not as sacred duties, but as business deals to be renegotiated or even junked. For Canada, this has meant direct threats of massive tariffs. For Europe, it has meant a constant questioning of NATO's very purpose. While Australia has so far dodged direct threats, the undercurrent of American unreliability is now a primary strategic concern. Nowhere is this anxiety more visible than in the AUKUS Security Pact. Announced back in 2021, AUKUS was meant to be Australia's great strategic leap, a plan to buy at least 3 American-made Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines to counter China's naval expansion. It was a monumental commitment, costing Australian taxpayers up to $368 billion and tying its defense to American tech and political will for the next 50 years. But that bet on American consistency is looking shakier by the day. The whole AUKUS deal rests on the promise that the U.S. will actually sell and transfer its most sensitive military technology. Yet by early 2026, Troubling questions were bubbling up in Washington. Concerns were being raised that in a potential conflict with China over Taiwan, the U.S. would want direct command of every sub it could get. Selling them to Australia would mean converting assets guaranteed to be available into assets that might not be, especially since Australia has said it's making no promises to automatically join a U.S.-led war over Taiwan. This single issue crystallizes Australia's dilemma. It's spending a fortune to embed itself deeper into a U.S. strategic system, just as that system is signaling it might not hold up its end of the bargain if its own immediate interests are at stake. It's like paying tribute to a king who is openly debating whether he'll bother to protect you. This is the fertile ground where Mark Carney's Davos speech landed. It gave a name to the nagging feeling in Canberra that the old way of doing business was over. Carney's argument was simple. In a world of giants, middle powers can't survive by going it alone. When you negotiate one-on-one with a superpower, he argued, you negotiate from weakness. You take what's offered. You even compete with other middle powers to be the most accommodating. That, he said, isn't sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting you're the junior partner. The alternative he pitched was a third path with impact, for middle powers like Canada, Australia, Japan, and South Korea to combine their strengths. They need to stop competing for scraps of favor from Washington or Beijing and start coordinating to create their own leverage. This means building resilient supply chains, forming flexible coalitions on trade and climate, and applying the same standards of conduct to allies and rivals alike. As he urged, don't call out economic bullying from one great power while staying silent when it comes from another, a thinly veiled jab at allies who tolerate American unilateralism out of fear. For a country like Australia, which has long seen itself as a creative middle power, Carney's message was both a challenge and a validation. It validated that Australia's anxieties were shared, and it challenged Canberra to think beyond rhetoric and consider what genuine strategic independence could look like. This is the critical context. The invitation to Carney to address Parliament isn't an act of breaking an alliance. It's an act of exploring the alternative to being subordinate. It is Australia taking the first real step down that third path Carney lit up in Davos. Mark Carney's Davos speech was more of a wake-up call than a detailed blueprint. But from its core ideas, we can sketch out a framework, a Carney doctrine, if you will, that would guide a new middle power coalition. This doctrine would likely rest on three key pillars, each designed to build collective strength and create some breathing room between the crushing gravity of the U.S. and China. For a country like Australia, adopting this would be a radical shift in its foreign policy. The first and most important pillar is taking back economic control. Carney's main point was that the tools of globalization, supply chains, finance, trade, have been turned into weapons by the great powers. The logical defense, then, is to build economic fortresses, not individually, but together. A world of separate little fortresses would be, as Carney put it, poorer, more fragile, and less sustainable. But a network of collaborating middle powers could create an economic bloc with the scale to actually compete. For Australia and Canada, this would have an immediate, obvious focus: critical minerals. Both nations are resource superpowers, sitting on vast reserves of the lithium, cobalt, and rare earths that power the 21st century economy. Historically, they've acted like simple quarries, digging raw materials out of the ground and shipping them to be processed elsewhere, mostly in China. This new doctrine would flip that script. You can easily picture a foundational step, like a jointly funded Allied Minerals Processing Corporation. This entity would invest in refineries in both Australia and Canada, breaking China's chokehold on midstream processing and letting both nations capture way more of the profits. Then, they could leverage that control. By coordinating their output and creating a trusted, high-standard supply chain, they could offer a secure alternative to manufacturers in Japan, South Korea, and Europe, who are desperate to reduce their own dependence on China. This isn't protectionism, it's strategic market making. It would transform Australia and Canada from price takers, subject to the whims of a single buyer, into price setters in a secure, transparent market. This logic extends beyond minerals. It would mean coordinated investments in clean energy tech, joint R&D in AI and quantum computing, and shared data infrastructure that isn't subject to surveillance by either American tech giants or the Chinese state. It's a slow, methodical process of untangling the threads of economic dependence and reweaving them into a stronger fabric of collective self-reliance. The second pillar is about creating diplomatic muscle. Individually, a middle power's voice is easy to ignore. A chorus of them speaking in unison, much harder to dismiss. This means moving beyond occasional cooperation to a culture of deep, regular diplomatic coordination. In practice, this could look like a middle powers contact group. This wouldn't be a formal, stuffy alliance like NATO, but a nimbler coalition that acts on specific issues. Before major votes at the UN, the WTO, or the G20, the foreign ministers of Australia, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and others would get on a call to align their positions. The goal? Forge a consensus and create a voting bloc big enough to shape outcomes and push back against US or Chinese pressure. Take international law. A key complaint from middle powers is that the big guys demand everyone else follow the rules while they feel free to break them. When the US threatens unilateral tariffs or China engages in economic coercion, the current response is a bunch of separate, weak protests. A coordinated response would be totally different. Imagine China imposes punitive tariffs on Australian barley. In the old world, Australia fights that battle alone. Under this new doctrine, a dozen countries might jointly launch a challenge at the WTO while also announcing a collective plan to buy the surplus barley, spreading the economic pain, and signaling that an attack on one is an issue for all. Conversely, if the US were to impose illegal tariffs on Canadian steel, this same coalition would react with a united front, maybe even imposing retaliatory tariffs as a bloc. This creates a powerful deterrent. It raises the cost of bullying. The great powers can no longer just isolate and squeeze a single smaller nation without risking a coordinated backlash from a huge chunk of the global economy. It's about changing the basic math of global diplomacy from a series of one-on-ones, where the middle power is always weaker, to a many-on-one dynamic where the collective has real power. The third and trickiest pillar is strategic hedging. This is the delicate part, as it directly confronts the security dependence that countries like Australia have on the United States. Nobody in Canberra or Ottawa is talking about a complete break from Washington. The U.S. military is still the only force that can balance China in the Indo-Pacific. But the Carney Doctrine implies that blind, absolute reliance on an unreliable partner is strategic suicide. Strategic hedging means building a more diverse security portfolio. For Australia, this would start with a hard-nosed reassessment of AUKUS. Instead of being the only solution, it would be seen as one component among many. Canberra would actively chase deeper defense partnerships with other middle powers, maybe partnering with Japan on submarine tech, South Korea on missile defense, or France on naval shipbuilding. The goal isn't to replace the U.S. alliance, but to supplement it and create backup plans. This builds what defense wonks call strategic optionality. It reduces Australia's vulnerability to the whims of a single election cycle in Washington, D.C. If a future U.S. administration decides to delay or cancel the AUKUS subs, Australia wouldn't be left strategically naked. This pillar also means Australia taking more responsibility for its own neighborhood, the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia. Instead of just acting as the American deputy sheriff in the region, Australia, working with countries like New Zealand and Indonesia, would lead its own patrols and disaster relief efforts, building influence independent of its alliance with the U.S. Ultimately, this pillar is about psychological independence. It's about breaking the habit of subcontracting strategic thinking to Washington. It's about asking, what is in Australia's interest, rather than, what does our great and powerful friend want us to do? It acknowledges that while the U.S. alliance is still vital, it can no longer be the only answer to every single question. For a nation that has lived under the American security umbrella its entire modern life, this is the most profound shift of all. Australia's decision to formally explore this third path won't happen in a vacuum. It's going to trigger a geopolitical earthquake, with aftershocks that will reshape the strategic landscape for every major player. The reactions from Washington and Beijing will be swift, severe, and incredibly revealing. For the United States, especially under an America First administration, Australia's move would be seen not as smart strategy, but as profound betrayal. The reaction would likely come in two stages: shock and fury, followed by punishment. The initial shock would come from a sense of entitlement. In Washington's view, allies like Australia are beneficiaries of American security, and they're expected to show loyalty. A pivot like this would be seen as stunning ingratitude. An administration led by Donald Trump, who famously sees alliances as purely transactional, would take this perceived slight personally. You can already imagine the rhetoric. The Canada-Australia partnership might be mocked as an axis of lightweights. The move would be framed as a foolish fantasy, a naive attempt by smaller nations to play in the big leagues. President Trump, as he did after Carney's original Davos speech, would likely renew threats, perhaps menacing Canada with tariffs and reminding Australia that its security depends entirely on American goodwill. This talk would quickly be followed by action. The most immediate and powerful lever the U.S. could pull is AUKUS. Washington could announce an immediate review of the whole program, effectively freezing progress on the submarines. The message would be crystal clear: loyalty has a price, and disloyalty has a cost. The unspoken threat would be killing the deal entirely, leaving Australia's multi-billion-dollar defense strategy in ruins. This hardline approach, however, comes with huge risks for the U.S. Such open bullying would prove the very point Carney was making, that America now uses its power to enforce subordination. It would likely push other nervous allies in Europe and Asia to speed up their own plans for strategic autonomy, fearing they could be next. In its attempt to punish Australia, the U.S. could accidentally become the best recruiting sergeant for the very middle power alliance it wants to crush. Beijing's reaction would be the polar opposite of Washington's: quiet satisfaction and cunning opportunism. China's grand strategy has long been to weaken the American alliance system, which it sees as a hostile circle designed to contain its rise. A major rift between the U.S. and one of its closest Pacific allies would be a strategic gift of immense value. Publicly, Beijing would say very little, framing the issue as a private matter for Australia and the U.S. to sort out. But behind the scenes, a flurry of activity would begin. China would immediately try to exploit the rift. It would likely send a high-level delegation to Canberra, offering to deepen economic ties. It might propose new long-term contracts for Australian iron ore and coal, offering price stability. It could offer to finally remove the last of its punitive tariffs on Australian wine and lobster, framing it as a gesture of goodwill to reward Australia's independent foreign policy. The strategic goal would be to show Australia and the watching world that while the U.S. offers threats and instability, China offers predictability and prosperity. It would be a masterclass in soft power, designed to pull Australia deeper into its economic orbit. This embrace, however, would be a careful one. Beijing knows Australia still views it with deep strategic mistrust. Any overt attempt to pull Australia into a security partnership would backfire spectacularly. Instead, China's play would be subtle. It would focus on economics and investment, aiming to slowly increase Australia's dependence and create a powerful pro-China lobby within the country. The clash between the American and Chinese reactions would ripple outwards, forcing the world to redraw its strategic map. The binary choice that has defined geopolitics for a decade, Team America or Team China, would suddenly be complicated by a third option. For other middle powers, Australia's pivot would be a watershed moment. Countries like Japan and South Korea, which face an even tougher version of Australia's dilemma, would be watching with intense interest. They are deeply dependent on U.S. security, but are also terrified by American unpredictability. They would almost certainly accelerate their own hedging strategies, likely leading to a surge in diplomatic talks between Tokyo, Seoul, and Canberra. In Europe, the reaction would be similar. Nations like France and Germany, which have long talked about strategic autonomy, would see Australia's move as a powerful validation of their worldview. It would strengthen the argument that Europe can no longer afford to outsource its security to a volatile Washington. The very idea of global alliances would be thrown into question. AUKUS, already facing doubts, could collapse. Other groups like the Quad would be strained as members start to diverge in their outlook. In their place, we'd see the rise of more flexible, issue-based partnerships that shift and change depending on the problem. The world would become more complex, more fluid, and maybe more unstable in the short term. The clear lines of the Cold War era would be gone, replaced by a messy and unpredictable world with multiple centers of power. This new world isn't without its dangers. A middle power coalition could prove fragile, but it also holds a promise, a potential escape from the logic of a new Cold War, a path that allows nations to cooperate on global challenges without being forced to pick a side in a great power deathmatch. Australia's decision to invite Mark Carney doesn't create this new world by itself, but it might be the symbolic act that signals the old one is well and truly over. This analysis covers a complex and shifting landscape, but that's our take. What do you think? Is a middle power alliance a viable third path, or is it a dangerous fantasy in a world run by giants? Can countries like Australia and Canada truly forge an independent path? Or are they destined to always be in the shadow of a great power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you find this kind of in-depth geopolitical analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to keep digging into the critical issues shaping our world, moving beyond the headlines to understand the deeper forces at play. The scenario of Australia inviting Mark Carney to its parliament is no longer just a geopolitical thought experiment. It's real, and it crystallizes one of the most profound questions of our time. In a world being reshaped by the US-China rivalry, can other nations actually chart their own course? For 70 years, the answer for a country like Australia was a clear, if sometimes uncomfortable, no. Its destiny was tied to the power and priorities of its alliance leader in Washington. But as we've explored, the ground beneath that old certainty is crumbling. The reliability of the United States is now a central question, not a given. The weaponization of the global economy has turned a source of prosperity into a tool of coercion. Mark Carney's speech at Davos didn't create these problems, it just gave them a name. His call for a middle power coalition, a third path with impact, is a direct response to this new, harsher reality. It's an argument that submission isn't safety, and that the only real sovereignty lies in collective action. The journey down this path would be full of peril. It would invite the anger of a wounded American hegemon and the opportunistic embrace of a rising China. It would test the resolve of the middle powers themselves. Success is far from guaranteed. Yet, the alternative, to do nothing, might be even riskier. To stay tethered to an unpredictable ally while your main economic partner sees you as a strategic rival is to be a ship without a rudder in a gathering storm. It is to accept, as Carney so vividly put it, that you will be on the menu. The ultimate significance of this shift isn't whether Australia breaks its alliance with the United States, it is whether it, and other nations like it, can build something new. A network of sovereign, resilient states capable of defending their own interests in a world where the great powers won't do it for them. In a world of giants, can the middle powers, by standing together, find the strength to stand on their own? The answer will define the shape of the 21st century.